Thank you all for being here. We're going to talk about technology, but we're only going to talk about it a little bit today. We're going to spend most of the time talking about something that is, I think, a little bit larger, the framework in which I think about technology as being an important emerging part of Jewish thought. But to kick us off, I want to show you a letter that was written 800 years ago by Maimonides, who's one of the most important Jewish philosophers, Jewish legal scholars of all time. And this is a letter he wrote at the very end of his life. He wrote it 4 years before he died. And this is a point in time at which Maimonides has written all the important books he's going to write, right? He's written his law code, he's written his Guide to the Perplexed, his book of philosophy, he's written everything. Now, you may know Maimonides lived in Cairo. The primary language that he is speaking and writing in is Arabic. He writes in Judeo-Arabic, which is Arabic written in Hebrew characters. And many of the books he is writing, he writes in Arabic, which is great if the Jews that he's trying to talk to are also Arabic-speaking Jews, and it's not so great if you're living in Europe and you don't speak or read Arabic. So what would happen is, as Maimonides' reputation, as his fame grew, he would start getting these letters which have a little bit of chutzpah in them. They would say, dear Mr. Maimonides, can you please translate your book into Hebrew for me? Because I don't understand and I would like to read it. And Maimonides wrote back this letter to the community of Lunel in France, basically saying, I'm sorry, I can't translate my works into Hebrew for you, and I wish I could. And I wish I could because I see that the movement of the Jewish world is shifting from where I live in the Middle East to Europe. And there's a kind of regret that he feels of I spent all this time writing in a language that fewer and fewer Jews are going to speak, and I made a mistake. He kind of regrets, I should have done things differently. And so he writes this letter that kind of gives his, kind of like a survey of how he sees the Jewish world in this moment in time, in the year 1200. And this is what he says. He says, I must inform you that in this difficult time there remain no people to raise the banner of Moshe and to scrutinize the words of Ravina and Ravashi, that is to say, the Talmud, except for you and the cities around you. Most large communities are dead, and the rest are moribund, and the remaining 3 or 4 places are ailing. In Palestine and the whole of Syria, only a single city, Aleppo, has a few wise men who study Torah, but they do not fully dedicate themselves to it. Only 2 or 3 grains can be found in the whole of Babylon and Persia. In all the cities of Yemen and all the Arab cities, a few people study the Talmud, but they do so only in a mercenary way, looking for gain. The Jews who live in India do not know the scriptures, and their only religious mark is that they keep the Sabbath and circumcise their sons on the 8th day. In the Muslim Persian cities, they read the scriptures literally, which is a big insult. What crazy person would read the Torah literally? As to the cities of the Maghreb, in North Africa, we already know the decrees that befell them, meaning there's a lot of anti-Jewish persecution of Jews during that time. You, brothers, our redeemers, are our only hope for help. Be strong and be strengthened for the sake of our nation, and strive to be people of valor, for everything depends upon you. Upon you is the obligation of yibum, whether to accept it or deny it. And to get a little bit technical here, there is a concept within Jewish law that if a man and a woman get married and the man dies before they have had any children, there's an obligation of the man's brother to marry the woman and to have children kind of in his name. So what Maimonides is kind of saying here is my version of Jewish civilization, the Middle Eastern Jewish civilization, is dying without children. And you have an obligation to kind of, continue to live on in our name. Whether to accept it or deny it, do not rely upon my battle for today. I am no longer able to go in and come out. That is to say, he's very old. And as I have become old and gray, not from great years, but from the nature of the body which knows my illness. May the Creator support you and give you renown and fame upon the earth. Amen. It's kind of a remarkable letter to write as someone who is, one of the most important, I think, figures of all of Jewish history, to kind of give this perspective. And the reason I want to show you this letter is that I think there are many points in Jewish history where Jews feel like this, where Jews feel like it's all over, it's all ending. The world that we thought we had, the country that we thought we could live in safely, it's all changing. And what was I doing? What am I supposed to be doing next? And then there's revivals, and more destruction and revivals, and kind of things keep going like that. But because Jews have been around for such a long time, I think there is often a tendency to see ourselves at the end of our own story, to see ourselves as kind of like in the final chapter of whatever story we've been telling for thousands and thousands of years. And that makes it hard to think about the places where there is an opportunity for innovation and for change and for growth. And I bring this up as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about technology because this perspective on the future could not be farther from the way that folks in the tech sector think about the future, right? How do folks in the tech sector think about the future? For them, basically, human history is just starting, right? The last 6,000 years of recorded history, 5,000 years of recorded history are almost nothing. They're just a kind of blip. I'm showing you the graphs in source number 2. This is from a book that came out a few years by William McCaskill, who basically says, if you think about the history of Homo sapiens as a species, we are only at the very beginning of that story, right? Homo sapiens have been around for only around 300,000 years. If you think about the lifetime of a species on the planet, that is really more towards the beginning than the end of our story. We can imagine humans being on the planet for at least another 700,000 years. What does it mean to plan for 700,000 years of human history? And I think there are lots of people in the tech sector who are talking about this, not ironically, thinking about the kind of evolution of humanity, thinking about what comes next. I think it is worth taking a page out of technologists' book to think about Jewish history, to use the way that they think about the future and the optimism and the chances for innovation and growth and bring that into Jewish thought. That doesn't mean giving up on the past, but it also means not being so burdened by it that you feel like there's actually no opportunities for major change. I worry that a lot of the time, we often see our role now as kind of like just adding footnotes on a story that somebody else wrote, and I think it's important to kind of get away from that. I would also argue that the Torah itself strongly suggests that we don't think in those terms of like, things are about to end. The best example I have for this is this story in Bereshit where Yaakov and Esav, at the very beginning, like they're kids, and Esav is the firstborn. Yaakov is sitting at home. Esav comes in from the field, and it says in source number 3, once when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esav came in from the open famished, and Esav said to Jacob, give me some of that red stuff to gulp down, for I am famished, which is why he was named Edom. And Jacob said, first sell me your birthright. Right? So I'll give you some food, but you have to make me the firstborn. So Jacob's kind of thinking far ahead, right? He's planning for the future. And Esav says, and this is I think the key line, I am at the point of death. So of what use is a birthright to me? Meaning from my perspective in that moment, I'm about to die. So what do I care about the future? What does it matter? And of course, Esav doesn't die, right? He's around for quite a lot longer. But Jacob is the one who ends up with the future. With the birthright. So I think it's important, and I think the Torah tells us this over and over again, is that we can't be short-term thinkers. We have to be long-term thinkers, and that's really critical. In the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, there's a famous statement of Ben Bagbag, a rabbi. He says, turn it over and turn it over again. Hafoch ba va'apoch ba dekula ba, for everything is in it. Which is often taken to mean, everything is already contained in the Torah. If you dig far enough, you'll always find something. I think that there's a kind of command there. You have to turn it over again, right? Torah has to be revolutionized over and over and over again. That's an active process. It's not searching. It's actually doing some real work to change the way that we see the Torah. So there is, I think, an obligation to change the way that we think about Torah, to build new branches onto the tree that is Torah. And what I want to do in the next few minutes is kind of walk through with you what I see as being the agenda for the future of Jewish thought. This is really kind of like my opinion on it. This is like my way of seeing it, having looked at the various places where it seems like there is interesting and important Jewish thought developing. If you have something that you think should be on this list and is not on this list, please tell me. We're not going to go through all of them in detail, but I want to show you at least all of them. So look at the boxes on the next page. All right. I suggest that there's basically 8 places where Jewish thought is developing in wildly new directions, is doing things that it hasn't done before. First, I want to tell you about the things that I'm not going to talk about. Let's talk about climate change. Right. Climate change, of course, is a new area of Jewish thought. Judaism has been dealing with climate change for several decades already. I think in the past we've dealt with climate change in a kind of preventative mode, a sense of like, let's create ideas about the importance of taking care of the planet, of making sure that things don't get too bad. Well, things have gotten pretty bad, and it looks like things are going to get worse, right? Meaning, at least in America, the climate change agenda, the environmentalist agenda, is really in tatters at the moment. And there is a very good chance that the way that we live, the places that people live, will change dramatically over the next few decades. This is true in America, it's true in Israel as well. The Middle East is projected to warm faster than the rest of the planet on the whole. And so the conditions of living in a place like Israel are probably going to change pretty dramatically in the next few decades, which is a thing that I don't know that we have the language yet to talk about that. So what it means to think about climate change in the context of Judaism is to think about not just prevention, but adaptation, and to help people process the feelings of sadness and grief they have for a planet that is changing its conditions pretty dramatically. So that's one. There's three that I kind of grouped together: feminist Torah, LGBTQ Torah, and the Torah of disability and neurodivergence. These three are somewhat of a kind in that all of them are expanding Jewish thought by including voices that had previously been excluded from Jewish conversations. The biggest and most important of it's strange to say most important, but I'd say like the oldest of these in relative terms is feminist Torah, right? Including women's voices in Torah study, Torah commentaries written by women, female leadership in Jewish community. This is, not, I think it's existed for all of our lives, but is still quite new in terms of the entire span of Jewish history. If you think about how long it's going to take before the number of Jewish books written by, the number of Torah books written by women rivals the number of Torah books written by men, that's going to take like centuries, right? It's going to take like a very long time to reach parity on that front. And so we're really kind of at the beginning of a process of developing feminist Torah. That is also true, and I think LGBTQ Torah, queer Torah, Torah written by people who are not straight, who have different gender identities, is also kind of at the beginning of its story, and I think is developing quickly, but is also going to take long to develop. And then the newest of the three is the Torah of disability and neurodivergence, because the way that we understand the human mind, the different kinds of minds that people can have, and the way that we think about things like ADHD and autism are also rapidly changing. And I think there's a kind of growing understanding that we need to think about different kinds of mental states when we think about Jewish community, and also to appreciate that people who kind of come into Jewish spaces are kind of coming and contributing in very different ways. So there's all of that. I think those need to be treated together. The last of the ones that I don't want to talk about is Zionism and diasporism. That is to say that after the foundation of the State of Israel, which is still in living memory for some people, we, I think, are struggling with a vision of like what the Jewish future in Israel looks like, how that exists alongside its Arab neighbors, and at the same time, I think visions of what it looks like to live in America and other places in the diaspora is also changing in significant ways. So there are, as you probably know, pretty significant generational differences between how people see the Jewish state, how people see Zionism in America. That is also true in Israel. I think there was a survey recently that basically most American Jews don't see themselves as Zionists, don't see themselves as non-Zionists, just kind of like don't see themselves in relationship to this project either way. And so there's new language I think that we need to develop around what is the meaning of both the Jewish state and also what is the meaning of the diaspora project at the same time. So those are the ones I don't want to talk about. So the ones I do want to talk about. First, let's talk about non-textual Torah. This is kind of like an awkward, like a kind of funny way to say it. So let me introduce it with a picture. Source number 7, this is a page from one of the earliest printed editions of the Talmud. So if you study Talmud, you may recognize the structure of the page. What is strange about this particular image of the Talmud?
All the blank spaces.
There's a bunch of blank spaces, right? Now, what do you think is supposed to go in those spaces?
Somebody's opinion.
Probably true. But, so what's supposed to go in the spaces is pictures. There's supposed to be pictures in those spaces. Now, the reason there's supposed to be pictures in those spaces is that there's portions of the Talmud that are actually quite difficult to understand without pictures. they, are talking about like kind of, the positioning of different walls and structures and relationship to each other. It would really be helpful to have pictures. But the Talmud is not a visual text, right? It's just text, basically. And in the early printed edition of the Talmud, they didn't have the facility to insert pictures into the printings, and so they did this like kind of funny thing where you would buy a Talmud, and it would have these holes in it, and it would be left as an exercise to the buyer to then kind of fill in the pictures themselves, right? Like, we're going to give you a half-made book, and then you kind of do it yourself. You can tell by the fact that the pictures aren't there. Not every person who bought a Talmud actually did this, right? It's not a great way of transmitting information to tell the person who's buying the book. Actually, it's up to you to figure out what you're supposed to put in those spaces. But that's exactly what they did. And you can tell if you turn over the next page, the way that people filled in these illustrations is complicated, and they didn't always do a great job, and it's done in all kinds of different ways. So we have not been great at transmitting things that are not text. In fact, we've been so bad at transmitting things that are not text that a lot of times when you think about like Torah or Jewish learning in your mind, it's basically equal to text. It's basically seen as being like the same thing as text, right? The Torah is a textual document. A lot of what it means to kind of like give over a Torah is to give people text study. When people are trained, when you train kids in studying Torah, you're basically training them in textual skills. I think that is very much a function of the fact that we are people who have had to move around a lot, and text is a relatively safe way of making sure that your ideas get out into the world and that they stay stable and you can kind of carry them on your back and do all that. We are now in a place, technologically speaking, culturally speaking, where we can transmit things that are not text with some amount of confidence. And that means we can transmit images, we can transmit music, we can transmit videos, we can transmit objects in ways that we had not been able to do previously. And so there was really an opening up of the concept of Torah itself, I think, to things that are not just text. And to give you a sense of the fact that this can be quite powerful, I want to show you a few images. One is the image that you see on the bottom of this page, which was probably distracting you as I was talking because it's a kind of a strange image. Does someone want to provide an interpretation of what you see in front of you? What is going on? Why does this object exist? What is it trying to tell you?
It's that instead of payment, it's getting around.
Right, so this is a Purim grogger, right? Purim is coming up. And why would you put Hitler into this object?
Because he is a hyena.
Right. And so this is an object produced in a DP camp, right, in 1947, and is a kind of visual interpretation of the Purim story, saying, right, like for us, Hitler is Haman, right, and it has like a kind of, I'm not sure if it's a coin or a medallion with Hitler's face in it, kind of like literally hanging from the grogger itself, right? The word you have in Hebrew is vayitlu. This is like from the verse in the book of Esther where they actually hang Haman, right? So this is like literally hanging Hitler as a result. I think this is a powerful object. It's a very striking object. You could make the same interpretation in words. It's much more powerful to make it in an image or in an object. There's a way that you kind of communicate something viscerally immediately by making it into an object that you couldn't do otherwise. I'll show you another example of this. There is this, I'm kind of obsessed with this phenomenon. You may know that in Israel, even before the foundation of the state, many of the kibbutzim basically reinvented Passover for themselves, reinvented the Seder. Many of these kibbutzim, they were socialist, communist, fiercely Zionist, of course, and at the same time were quite secular. And so they appreciated the holiday of Pesach, but they did not want to go through the traditional Haggadah. And so what they did, over and over again, is reinvent the Haggadah from the ground up. Reinvented it as an agricultural holiday, reinvented it as a holiday to celebrate community. Sometimes, especially in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, reinvented it as a holiday that was both to celebrate the kind of the existence of Jews in Israel and also mourn the Jews lost in Europe, which is like a strange thing we don't do today, where we kind of like have Pesach be a holiday of mourning. But this is before the establishment of Yom HaShoah. Like there wasn't another time to do it, so they're like, okay, we're going to do it on Pesach. We're just going to kind of combine everything. And what you end up with is these amazing books that are illustrated that give you a little bit of a window into the kind of creativity of that moment. There's all kinds of amazing things you can find in these kibbutz haggadot. Things like, in the four sons, I'm sorry, not the four sons, the four questions you ask at the Seder, the manishtana. So, they'll give you four different questions. One of the questions is, why on this night, as opposed to all other nights, are we eating with our parents? Because, as you may know, in many kibbutzim, the parents and the children do not live together. The kind of children all live together in their own kind of like children's house and are taken care of, by themselves. They see their parents for like a couple of hours a day, but they're living by themselves. And the only time that the parents and children are actually eating together is on Pesach. So it's like, oh, that's what makes Pesach special. This image I find particularly powerful. So this is an image of, a bunch of Jewish people who have just left Egypt. They're walking into what? What room are they walking into? If you've been to a kibbutz, what room is this in the kibbutz? This is the Chadar Ochel. This is the dining hall, which if you have been to a kibbutz dining hall, this is not a glamorous room. It's like, like a very, grungy, kind of like dirty room with like the fluorescent lighting and all the rest. But for them, like, this is the dream, right? This is what it means to, relive the Passover story, is to go into the dining hall and imagine, like, people are using this book in the dining hall as this is happening. You can actually find, YouTube videos online of these ceremonies. They're quite amazing. I'll give you just one more example because they're so great. The very last part of the Seder is what? Of the Haggadah. What's the very last thing you do in the Haggadah?
You say next year in Jerusalem.
Yeah, but okay, what's the song? What's the last song you sing in the Seder? Chad Gadya, right? Right, Chad Gadya, right? The song about the goat that, is eaten by the calves, eaten by the dog, right? It's kind of like a silly song. It's like a drinking song. It doesn't have much meaning one way or the other. But if you are an anti-capitalist kibbutz, the Chad Gadya is a problematic song because Chad Gadya is a capitalist song. Right? It's about, like, it's dog eat dog, almost literally, right? Like, the animals are eating each other, and they didn't like it. They didn't like that song. And so many of the kibbutzim basically revise Chad Gadya in two ways. First of all, Chad Gadya is written in what language? Aramaic. It's not written in Hebrew, right? And the kibbutzim are like, we're not reading a song in Aramaic. We're reading a song in Hebrew, right? We are Hebrew speakers. So first of all, they revise the song, put it in Hebrew, and then they do an amazing thing, which is they say, instead of having the cat eat the goat, how about the cat goes up to the goat and says, hello, I have my special set of skills. I would like to join you in your commune, and we together will contribute to, some collective project. And then the dog comes along and is like, hello, I would also like to contribute to your project. And like all the animals kind of come together, and they're all contributing to a great project. And so it's like basically reimagining Chad Gadya as this socialist utopia. So I've given you like one version of this in English of this different Chad Gadya. Notably, in this version of the song ends with the ox, right? It ends before the butcher, ends before the angel of death, right? Because part of what is keeping these communities together is also a sense of danger, a sense of fear from the outside. So like there is an angel of death that is not invited to the kibbutz, who kind of like sits outside and represents like the external threats. So this is kind of like one piece of it. This sense of there are opportunities to revise Torah over and over and over again through the use of these different media. And I think that's quite powerful, and I think it's worth looking at the places where people are developing new kinds of Jewish content that is not just in text. So that's one piece. Now you go to a very, very different place. I want to show you a couple of documents that are quite recent. If you turn to page 7. So the first is I want to show you, this is an ad I found last year for I guess a clinic in Lakewood. This Pesach, don't just remember Cherut, that is freedom, experience it. Ketamine. And this is an ad for a Passover time ketamine experience, a kind of like, a kind of psychedelic experience that people would have over Passover. That's on the left. On the right is what looks like a page of Talmud. It's in fact not a page of Talmud. This is put together by a guy who lives in Israel. And it's basically a description of an ayahuasca experience, also a kind of psychedelic experience, but describing it using kind of like the imagery of Talmud. The reason I'm showing you both of these documents is that one of the other areas where you see kind of rapid and quite energetic development in Jewish thought is around the use of psychedelics. Now, there is not really an ancient history of Jewish psychedelic use. Many people have tried to find it. Like, was the incense used in the temple, was that like psychedelic in some way? Probably not. We don't really have any sense of this. However, there is a modern and quite vigorous Jewish use of psychedelics, beginning in the 20th century, going into the 21st century, that exists across all parts of Jewish life in both America and in Israel. Part of it happens because of Israeli soldiers after leaving their service, kind of traveling the world, going to India, going to Thailand, having their own experiences. But it also exists in many parts of the ultra-Orthodox community, where the rituals that you would see around South American, Central American psychedelic use are kind of transported, right? You replace the songs that the kind of shamanistic songs with nigunim, with like Jewish songs. This is happening rapidly, and I would say it's happening increasingly above ground. It's happening because of the way that there's kind of thawing in regulatory policy around psychedelic use, around cannabis use in America and in Israel. People are willing to talk about this a lot more. And so there's a development of a sense of like, what does this have to do with the other? How can psychedelics inform one's Jewish experience? How can Judaism kind of provide frameworks for psychedelic experiences? The kind of like most important text, I would say, of this emergent movement was written by Zalman Schachter Shalomi in the 1960s. So Zalman Schachter Shalomi, he is working at Ramah Berkshires, and he takes a day off to drop LSD, to drop acid with Timothy Leary, and then he writes about it. He basically talks into a microphone for 3 hours, and then they publish this account of it. And so this is what he says. He says, I started to dance with Timothy Leary, and I said, oh, this is great, this is so inexpensive. Inexpensive not in the sense of it didn't cost so much, but inexpensive in the sense that he is having a spiritual experience without having to spend like 5 days in the woods or fasting or things like that. Meaning it's expensive in that he just had to, put something on his tongue. How much fasting would one have to do in order to get there, How much sensory deprivation? To be able to get oneself into, with a mere sip like this, how great, how inexpensive, this is great, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened. First of all, was it an aliyah haneshama? Did like his soul arise to like some greater plane? I would have sworn on the trip to New York afterwards that it was. Now I wouldn't swear to it because I was being swept by the experience. I didn't go anywhere. The sense of going to a destination, raising my questions with a heavenly mentor, coming back with a specific answer from there, that is one reason. Another reason was that it wasn't Jewish enough for me. The universe in which everything was happening wasn't Jewish enough, which I think is something that many Jewish psychedelic users will comment upon, this question of like, well, it's Jewish because I'm Jewish, but the drugs themselves aren't Jewish in any significant sense, right? If a Christian or a Muslim has the same substance, it's going to amplify the things that are part of their cultures. That later, when I started to find, when Shabbat came, I found some things in Shabbat that weren't in LSD. That is to say, it's not like a shortcut around Jewish ritual, it's a kind of supplement, it overlaps. Then I started to skim some Hasidic material in order to see where there are things that stand out, and I found that there were many. It is bound to be taken by more and more people. We need to train Jewish spiritual leaders in the LSD experience, put our text to use. What I would want to do if I had the opportunity, again, is to control it in the shtibel setting with more of Jewish paraphernalia, music, pictures, space arrangement, but I would also want to have someone who is going to be the ground control, to keep on calling attention to some Jewish program because I was complaining before saying that it took hold of me and I had nothing to do with it. Maybe we ought to make a sacrament out of it, to be administered, as it were, in shul, under given situations with certain things. And I would say like that idea has kind of remained alive. The question of like, what does it mean to integrate these substances into Jewish settings? I think it's a kind of live question. There's lots of folks today who have been experimenting with like use of cannabis on Shabbat. Cannabis as a kind of like enhancement of Shabbat. Same thing happens for magic mushrooms, for all kind of substances. So this is a kind of like emergent area. I would say what is interesting about this area is that there's a lot of interest among Jewish laity. Jewish leaders, I think, are still kind of afraid to touch this. I think there's still a kind of lingering sense of like, wait a minute, but like this is illegal. So like we probably shouldn't be talking about this. So there's a kind of mismatch there that I think will be, I hope will be adjusted somewhat quickly.
There was recently a retreat for clergy and Jewish professionals where some sort of psychedelic was administered to address burden.
Yes, and there's another one coming up in a few months. Actually, the application is still open for the next few days.
I wasn't, to be clear, I was not there.
Yeah.
But I know it happened. It's shift caught. If I'm not talking about.
So this is rapidly developing. The last thing I'll say, because there's much more to say, we can talk about technology. I've talked about technology before, but obviously there is a lot going on in terms of the Jewish embrace of technology, Jews writing about technology generally, trying to be a kind of moderating frame, being a moral voice in it. There's also technology being used in all kinds of Jewish settings, and Jews trying to figure out when are the right moments to accept technology, to reject technology, right? And I think we have good examples of Jews accepting technology and it goes well, and it goes badly, and Jews rejecting technology and it goes well and it goes badly. I'll give you one example where I think Jews rejected a technology and I think it was a bad idea. Electric menorahs. This seems like a small thing, but I don't know like what your experience is around November, December, where your entire street is lit up except for the Jewish houses. Right? The Jewish houses, the ones that have like their dinky little menorahs in the window, and like everyone else has like a lawn that's like full of ornaments. That didn't have to happen that way. It could have happened another way. There was a decision made at the beginning of the 20th century to say, you know what, we're going to keep menorahs as a kind of physical, like actual flames. We're going to have like wax candles. We're going to have olive oil, but we're not going to do like a big lawn display. Meanwhile, Christmas lights originally also started as being physical candles, right? Originally, you have, in Germany and England, you have people like literally bringing trees into their house and attaching literal candles to the branches of the tree, which is obviously a big fire hazard. And so because of that, when electric lighting came about, people were really excited about the idea of having electric lights on their Christmas trees instead of, actual candles. And then once you have the lights on the Christmas tree, you're like, well, why don't I take the lights outside? And why don't I not just do a tree, but I'll light up my whole lawn? You can imagine Jews kind of following a similar path. We decided not to. We rejected that technology, at least in that instance. I think it was a mistake. I think, it resulted in Hanukkah celebrations that are visually a lot less striking than they could be. We can talk more about that. The last thing I want to leave you with is this kind of, I think, fear that a lot of us have. Because part of what I'm talking about is pretty significant changes to the nature of Judaism and pretty significant changes to the way that we think about Jewish thought, the way that others think about Judaism, the way that we imagine what it means to be Jewish, and the things that we try to champion. It is scary to be ushering in that world because you're ushering in a world in which Judaism is changing from the Judaism that you yourself may have grown up with. That fear, like the recognition of that fear, also has a kind of pedigree in Judaism. There's a story about Choni HaMa'agel. Choni HaMa'agel was a rabbi who, in the Talmud, basically gets transported 70 years into the future. Like he goes to sleep and wakes up and it's 70 years later. Now, if you wake up and 70 years into the future, you might think like, wow, this is cool, like all these flying cars and everything else. Like, there could be that moment of feeling like, I'm so glad I got privileged to see the future world. But Choni doesn't feel like that. Choni actually kind of comes out of that experience and he goes into this is source number 13, Choni went home and said to the members of the household, is the son of Choni HaMa'agel alive? That is to say, is my own son still alive? And they say, no, he's not alive. But his son's son is alive, that is to say, your grandson's alive. He said to them, I'm Choni HaMa'agel, and they didn't believe him. He went to the study hall where he heard the sages say about one scholar, his halachot are as enlightening and as clear as in the years of Choni HaMa'agel. For when Choni HaMa'agel would enter the study hall, he would resolve for the sages any difficulty they had. That is to say, they have a good memory of this person, but that person is standing in front of them and they don't recognize him. Choni said to them, that's me, I'm he. But they did not believe him and did not pay him any proper respect. Choni became very upset and he prayed for mercy and he died. That's to say, basically he couldn't figure out how to live in this world, even though this is a world that he helped usher himself in. So I raise this because I think one of the kind of counters to these ideas is to say, like, it feels too foreign, or I couldn't imagine myself in this world. But I think what we're talking about when we're talking about a kind of transformation of Jewish life is a world that is going to be foreign to us, a world that is going to be unfamiliar. And I think that is scary, but it's also something that is important to accept. So I've talked enough. I'll stop here, and I'm curious about your questions.
Thank you so much. So I get the pleasure and the privilege of kicking off our questions and answers, but I'll start, and I hope that you'll join in because I'm sure you also have many questions. My first question is regarding this idea of being at the beginning, not the end of our own story. You mentioned in the letter from Maimonides, this concept of that for many years, for centuries, the Jews have felt like we're at the end of our story. There's this sort of survivalist model. But if we're closer to the beginning than at the end, how does this change how we raise our children, how we teach our children? What do we need to do differently?
I think the most important thing is to trust them to put forward good ideas and to be good bearers of the tradition. I think when you have an old tradition, it is easy to judge young people on the standards of like, are you, do you have good fidelity to the things that came before you? And to basically think like, well, I want them to exist in a certain way. I want them to kind of put forward certain ideas, but to not trust them in and of themselves. And I think for a lot of the emergent ideas of Jewish thought, they exist because there are people who identify as Jewish who take them seriously. I think like psychedelics is a good example of this, right? It doesn't exist within Judaism because there's an ancient history. They're not following in ancient footsteps. It exists because there's lots of people who are Jewish who are saying like, I see this as part of Judaism. And so I think you have to begin with a level of like, really strong trust that the Jewish community will, evolve and develop, and that Jewish people as a community, as an ethnicity, as a civilization, has that power.
And how do we do that while still studying our history and how do we help our future see a more optimistic outlook when our history is not the most optimistic?
Yeah. So there's a couple of pieces to that. One is, like I'm saying that we should be following in the footsteps of technologists on this. One major difference between Jewish futurism and technological futurism is that I think Jewish futurism doesn't reject its own past, doesn't say, we are going into the future at the expense of everything that came before. I think a lot of the rhetoric you see around technology is of actually, like, we're starting now. Like, forget everything that came before. Technology, on the whole, has a tendency to erase its own past. Right? New technologies replace old technologies. There's often a strong economic incentive to downplay the importance of previous technologies. I think Judaism should not be doing that, and I think actually, even within the technological sector, one of the things that Judaism can provide is, yes, like we are interested in the future, we want things to change, and at the same time, we want to make sure we don't forget the past. That's one piece of it. The second piece of it is, in terms of concerns around self-preservation. I think one of the kind of like the greatest victories that we could provide to anti-Semites is to take Judaism from a religion of ethics and make it into a religion of survival. It's a religion that really only cares about its own continued preservation. I think that there's a lot of reasons why we would want to do that because we've been attacked for a very long time, and I think like people who have the trauma of like generations of struggle and suffering and persecution and death will often, will focus on like, I just want to keep on living. And I think it's very important that we as a Jewish people are not just about continuing to live, but also are about ideas and about changing the world and making it a better place. And I think that is the way to make sure that the kind of hatred of Judaism that we see in so many places doesn't kind of like make its way into the heart of who we are.
I was fascinated by your the lectures menorah. I'll tell you a quick funny story. My 4-year-old son was here, like said, Mom, we're gonna celebrate Christmas as we were driving by all the Christmas lights. And I said, once again, and Hanny said, that's okay, Mom. I'm going to celebrate Christmas in my mind. Because he's seeing all of and that is like very on brand for my kids, but he's seeing all the Christmas lights everywhere. It's arguably cooler. Like to a 4-year-old, it is cooler. And I'm sort of the mindset, well, no, we need to preserve, our tradition. But are you suggesting maybe it's okay, like maybe preserving Judaism is leaning in a little bit to what the rest of the world is doing? Maybe that will make him and all of our kids think, Hanukkah's as cool as Christmas?
Yeah. Well, so Hanukkah is a really good example of this because Hanukkah has evolved so much over the last century or so. It's funny because I think a lot of times there is an unfair comparison made between Hanukkah and Christmas, as though like these are, because they're at the same time of year, they're both kind of like holidays around the solstice that Hanukkah never comes off well in a battle against Christmas. Right? Like Christmas is better than Hanukkah. I think objectively that is true, but I actually don't think Hanukkah is the right comparison. Christmas is, at least in America, is really the maybe with the addition of New Year, is the only time in American society where we have a concept of like no one's supposed to be working, right? Like it's often like for many stores, it's like the only day that they are actually closed. That everyone's at home, everyone's with family, and that's so much a part of our culture that there are these songs that we write about it. Like it's the most wonderful time of the year, right? All that stuff. Jews have something like that too. It just happens every week. And I think in a lot of ways, the culture around Christmas resembles the culture of Shabbat much more than it does the culture of Hanukkah, up to and including the songs, right? There are songs on Shabbat around like Yom Zeh Mechubad Mikol Yomim. This day is like honored above all other days, which sounds kind of a lot like this is the most wonderful day of the year, most wonderful time of the year, right? And also like all the food and all the family and all that other stuff. So I'm in a lot of ways like I'm really glad that we've been able to preserve that on a weekly basis. The truth of the matter is there was a time when American Christians tried to preserve that on a weekly basis too, tried to make every Sunday be a real day of rest, to not have streetcars running, to have most businesses closed, and that basically failed. Basically, by the beginning of the 20th century, that project was dead. Yes, there are still like blue laws in some counties, but it's mostly does not exist. And all there is Christmas instead. So that's what I would offer to your child. Like,
Did Hanukkah precede Christmas?
Chronologically, sure, it did. But there's a great book, I believe it's called Hanukkah in America, about how there is basically a project by American rabbis to turn Hanukkah into a Christmas-like holiday, to like introduce Hanukkah pageants and to have all the gifts and all the other stuff. Meaning like there was a sense of like we need to have something around this time of year because otherwise we're just going to have a lot of Jewish children who are just celebrating Christmas instead. So like there was like an intentional project to establish Hanukkah as a kind of anti-Christmas, even if it's not as good as Christmas, to have like Jewish children have something to do.
Please, okay.
I think from Kiss Day, what he took from the sin back.
Right.
Yeah. One of the things you said early on is whether we want to introduce another little square here. So I want to offer one that I care about. I think in terms of the way Jewish, not just Jewish thought, but Jewish experience in life is developing, I think there is a really growing number of people who are interested, and maybe it's connected to that trend, what do you call it? Psychedelic thing, but not really. But it's the same, maybe sticking with that. I want to experience God in my life, right? Experientially. I want to hear God. I want to know what God is guiding me to. So that more experiential spirituality. And not so much in the psychedelic sense that, I want to be right there in that other dimension, free. But on the other way, that is more Jewish, in the sense that I want to hear God and I want to embody it. I want to bring it into my cooking. I want to bring it into my choices. I want to bring it in and act with it and create a better world, a world of love and kindness and all that we cherish, right?
Yeah.
So I'm seeing that develop both for individuals, but also for communities. How do we kind of receive more beautifully applied experience? What promise that God is here and in us and with us and all of that good stuff, and bring it into this beautiful, maybe what the kibbutz was trying to do without God, we can do with God, because there's a way to create loving communities that are so beautiful that they are a light, right? Being a light to the nation. So I think what I see for the future is that we're going to develop that technology between us and God not depending on AI. Because we don't want to be hybrid, right? We don't want to have all these chips telling us how to connect to God. But we want somehow to open our hearts and minds in such a way that God can flow through us into our relationships. And I see Israel becoming an example where these innovations happening. It's a nation of innovation. It will happen at that level of these social things popping in new ways, new version of tools, and spread like fire all over the soil, where others will be ready also to embody too. And in that way, I think Judaism will be so much more universal in the sense that there will be less of a rejection. Because we feel rejected all the time, right, in history. It's not persecuted, but we're feeling the split right now in the world, right? I mean, there is such evil stuff happening. But there's a lot of good. There's a lot of these people opening up to this kind of psychedelic-like experience where they're doing it without the psychedelics.
Yeah. So
And for the purpose of bringing it into life on Earth.
Yeah.
Not in order to be somewhere.
Yeah, so I think this is a project which is really like decades in the making. There are a lot of Jews who've been attracted to Buddhism out of a sense of there is something in other faiths which is a kind of complement to what you see in Judaism, but perhaps contains more spirituality or more mindfulness. I see that growing. There's an Institute of Jewish Spirituality which kind of like offers meditation. There's like all kinds of Jewish meditation which is developing. I think it's still in its very early stages. They're actually, a few months ago I was trying to learn about like what actually like is Jewish meditation, like what are the kind of the authentic practices, because a lot of things that are called Jewish meditation are basically just Buddhist meditation with kind of like a Jewish like veneer on it. It's not that Jewish meditation doesn't exist, but a lot of the practitioners unfortunately died in the Holocaust. There's kind of rupture in some of those traditions. So I think we are relearning some of that right now. But I agree with you. There is a kind of a hunger for that, which still has not become a kind of core part of like, if you grow up Jewish, that you necessarily learn all these things. It's often a kind of supplement or a corrective to folks who are not finding what they want, in the traditional structures of Jewish community and need to seek out something in addition. It probably should make its way into the kind of the core practices of Jewish thought, but it's going to take a while.
Is
Yeah.
happening, maybe it does. Kabbalah, which was once just for the belief that the few that were cannabis, mystics and so on. Well, now it's for everyone.
Right, so this is another good example of it, where Kabbalah, also still, most kids do not learn Kabbalah in school. Most kids do not learn Jewish mysticism in school. It's going to take a while to get there.
So something you said towards the beginning was talking about how we have a tendency, right, going back to the Rambam's letter, of seeing ourselves as if we're at the end, and that's not something that's new, and that it was a thread throughout. I wonder how much of that is connected to, we talk about it a little more now, but the idea of messianism, right? Like we anticipate, right? Like we hope for the time when Mashiach will come. Like that gets colored a lot as being seen as like not the Jewish idea, but it's a very clear strain through Jewish liturgy, practice, etc. If we want the end to come, of course we want the end, right? Like it's tautological, but it's right in there. How does that? I don't know what the question is there, but like, can you speak to that a little bit, because it is a big thought in a lot of Jewish practice, but. And it makes sense that we want to push away from that, but I'm curious to hear you speak.
Yeah, so in the end of the 19th century, there was an American journalist named Edward Bellamy. Have you ever heard of Edward Bellamy? He wrote a book called Looking Backwards, 1871 to 2000. This was I think the third most popular book written in America in the 19th century. The book is about a journalist, who falls asleep and wakes up in the year 2000, and America is a utopia, right? And the book is about how we got there, basically. One of the readers of this book was Theodore Herzl, who read this book and who wrote basically a Jewish version of it about a Zionist state. And he wasn't the only one. There was, I think, 6 other Zionist utopias written around the same time, all basically modeled after Edward Bellamy. The reason this is happening at the end of the 19th century is because there is a shift at that time in the way that people are thinking about the future itself. People are seeing progress as now being a kind of constant in human history. They see progress changing so rapidly that they now expect that the world that their children are going to grow up in is going to look different from the world that they themselves grew up in. This is also the era, so Edward Bellamy's book is one of the earliest works of science fiction. If you're familiar with H.G. Wells' short story, The Time Machine, right? It's also written around this time. Not just, and the reason that kind of he's writing it is as an expression of an idea that he himself is putting forward about the way that we think about the future is itself changing. It's changing so much that we can talk about kind of like moving backwards and forwards in the future to the future and the past in the way that you might think about moving, from one continent to another. So that's like a radically different way of thinking about the future. And I think is specifically different from a messianic way of thinking about the future, which imagines the future as a kind of absolute end, an end past which things are just kind of like in a constant state of goodness. Judaism and many other religions were developed during a period when that notion of the future did not exist. And so there is this kind of run to like, well, the future is about messianism. I don't think messianism is actually very helpful in this moment because it's imagining that the future ends, and the future doesn't end. It just kind of keeps going. I think like that's actually one of the things that we struggle with. That like Jewish history doesn't have a conclusion. Jewish history continues to evolve and it continues to develop, and there is something a little bit scary about like that just kind of vast opening. That like what would it even mean to imagine Judaism in the year 6000, like 6000 C, not on the Jewish calendar, and that takes a kind of like imagination that I think in some ways like a messianic idea often is kind of intended to put a stop to. So in some ways I see like this notion of Jewish futurism as standing in opposition to a messianic notion.
At the time of the first Zionist Congress, Herzl thought that God, the gift of God, or maybe God himself was electricity, which was a relatively new ecological development. And what it enabled was when he had the first Zionist Congress, it was not just a meeting, but it was transmitted across oceans back to the United States and elsewhere with photography, which was relatively new, and newspaper coverage, telegrams of things. So he was able, with that technology, to leverage the first Zionist Congress in a way that wouldn't have happened if there'd just been a meeting, in Basel. So
Yeah.
He wasn't religious, he wasn't observant, but he believed in a higher or something, and he thought electricity was it.
What is interesting, you told me that in predicting into the future, I think Congress within 50 years of the state of Israel, and the state of Israel came back exactly to the day, 50 years from which you made that okra.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the processes by which historically, and even today, the Jewish people have made decisions about change. So like, I'm sure to some extent, Judaism has changed in ad hoc ways at times throughout our history, not intentional ways, but to the extent that we make intended decisions. And obviously there are differences in different segments of the community about that, but I'm wondering if you could just kind of give a little bit of insight into how we made those decisions, what were they approved, and what the approval process, things of that nature, and how might we do it going forward, or the changes we want to make to those processes to be open to the modernity that you described.
Yes, so you may not be surprised to learn that Judaism is a decentralized religion and doesn't make decisions, in an organized way very often. A lot of times what happens is somebody looks at changes that are being developed around them or being developed in the previous generation and say like, oh, like I see that as just being a core part of Judaism now. I'll tell you a story. This is a true story, which kind of brings this to life for me. So my great grandfather, living in Canada in the 1920s, took a trip to Israel, to Palestine, and while he was there, he decided that he wanted to commission a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll. So he goes to a Torah scribe, to a sofer, and says, please make me a Torah scroll. And the scribe says to him, sure. How big would you like it to be? And my great-grandfather says, I have no idea. So the scribe says to him, I want you to go to a local shul, find a Torah scroll that you like, measure it, and give me the measurements, and then come back. Simple task, right? So my great-grandfather does this, and he makes a mistake. So like if you picture a Torah scroll in your mind, right, there's a scroll, and then the scroll is held by these two poles, right, the Atzei Chaim, right, the wooden poles. The Atzei Chaim extend beyond the scroll itself. Now, when a sofer says, I want you to measure a Torah scroll and tell me how big you want it to be, the scribe means the parchment, right? Because that is what the scribe is working on. But my great-grandfather was like, that's not what Torah means to me. To me, Torah is the scroll, and it's also the thing holding the scroll. And so he comes back to the scribe with the measurements of a gigantic Torah. He tells him, like, I want you to make, and so that's what happens. He makes him this gigantic Torah scroll, and which, is actually still in use today. It's still in use in a Chabad in Toronto. I had a chance to visit it a few years ago. It's a beautiful scroll. It's like, it's 100 years old at this point. I love that story because that is a perfect way of thinking about the way that these ideas develop. It is not intentional in some ways. It's, one person seeing another person holding a Torah, and it's like, I see a Torah as not just the thing you're holding, but also you. Like you, by holding the Torah, also become Torah. So it's a kind of multi-generational, it's an intergenerational process of trusting that previous generations in advocating for certain kinds of developments in Torah and expanding it are themselves Torah. So that is not a process that can always be planned, but it involves a lot of faith in people.
Yeah, would you like to comment on being taught, we've spoken so eloquently over the last few days, and today we're talking a lot about predicting into the future, and quoted several Torah verses. So in the Torah, at the end of the Torah, where Moses was getting his was state, he says that the Jews were disobey God's commandments, will be scattered throughout the world, they'll be persecuted, but in the end of times, the stranger will come to the land, the Jews will return and repent, and will return to their land. And that's exactly what happened. And Jews were persecuted, were banished all over the world. And then it's very interesting that the Hamashiach to return and repent is 1948, which is exactly the year that Israel was founded. Prior to that, history, so we spoke about Herzl, and then there was Ottoman Land Act in 1917, and then in 1947, the United Nations, in 1948, the State of Israel. So a lot of this, the strange of the land was that coming to the land was actually Mark Twain, who came to the land in 1867, yet heralds the return of Israel, because with the Ottoman Land Act, that was when Jews were first allowed to buy land in what was then land occupied by the Roman Terms. So a lot of this was prophesied by Moses. That was in the Torah anyway. So it wasn't AI winning those futuristic things they could play. So maybe you'd like to comment.
Yeah. I guess I struggle to look at Torah that way, meaning I struggle to. I don't love the idea that like we have to find a source for everything that we do today in the name of Judaism in the Torah somewhere. I worry that it ends up being limiting and also can end up diminishing people today out of a sense of like all like the really valuable stuff is back there, and like you can only really have value within the Jewish world if you find a source back there. So like if it's useful rhetorically, great, but I also want to make sure people today have a sense of freedom around like what it means to innovate and create around Torah, and trust that like just by virtue of being Jewish, like that's really that's enough.
I have one more question from Jay.
Let me try casting AI in a slightly different way. AI is this generation's Pharaoh. And so when we talk about these changes, we can look in our history at Moses, who was sent there against his will by God. We can look at what I was thinking of while this discussion was going on with Yochanan ben Zakkai. Okay, that there are people who faced catastrophic changes. The Pharaoh enslaved the Israel. The Romans knocked over the second town. We were exiled from the western part of Europe out to Poland and Russia, and we did all right for a while. So the czars, if you will, and then was the Herzl, except that his state was created just a little too late. But these are could you see these as the kinds of historical responses that we have to look for going so?
I would say like if they are useful for people, great. Meaning like if they are useful rhetorically, if people find meaning in them, wonderful. I just don't want people to feel limited by it. I don't want people to feel limited by those. But if people find it useful, then great.
Okay.
Thank you so much for this morning, for being here all week, for everything and all of the wisdom you've shared with us. It's really been wonderful. Very
Holistic